All right, so I'm going to get us started with a few announcements while people trickle in. My name is Chris Kaufman. I'm not only a librarian and former student of Dr. Hussey, but I'm also the chair of the Massachusetts Library Association's Library and Information Technology section, which is now the Combined Technology and Technical Services section of the MLA. If you are a member of the MLA or interested in learning more about becoming a member and would like to be involved in planning future programming or anything else like representing this section in the MLA conference committee, please let me know. Just so you're all aware, the Massachusetts Library Association's annual conference is coming up on May 19th and 20th at the Seacrest Resort in North Falmouth here on Cape Cod. And lastly, please save the date for our next event, which will be Thursday, June 5th, and we will be discussing accessibility in libraries. First, a presentation of the current status of research into disability and accessibility in library services, as well as free and low-cost ways to improve accessibility in libraries, and particularly for people with invisible disabilities, and then an open discussion so we can all share our challenges and successes and learn from each other. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Hussey, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, and I'd also like to thank all of you for coming. I always appreciate, as you probably already heard me say, I love to gush about the work and the time that I've done in Rwanda. And I'm always, when Chris asked me, I'd be happy to do this. I was like, yes, 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 yes. So I'm going to share my screen. And by the way, I will be set I'm happy to share these PowerPoints afterwards. So I will send them to Chris, but also feel free to contact me directly if you actually would like to get a hold of these. And so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about the work that I've done in Rwanda and working with libraries there. And I just want to start with this first slide. The image on the right is actually the public library in Rwanda, in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. And it's literally across the street from the U.S. Embassy. So this particular library has been heavily influenced by the American library system. There was a lot of assistance in putting it together from the U.S. Embassy. So you walk into this library, it actually feels very much like into a public library in the U.S. The one thing I will say is that the library is beautiful and it's very heavily used. When I walked in, there were a lot of people in there. But one of the things that really impressed me was that they made sure that the children's department was closed off. And what I mean, that you could close doors so that the kids could be loud, so they could do story time, so that they understood that the idea of like having it be a fun place for kids, which I thought was really, really, really cool. And I just want to say the picture on the left, that's just a picture of part of the countryside in Rwanda. It is an amazingly beautiful country. And it is, a place I'm always love to go back to. The people there are lovely. The country is absolutely stunning. And it is really an amazing place. And so I'll stop gushing about that and talk a little bit about the work that I've done there. But I wanted to start by talking about a couple of what I see as important details when I'm talking Rwanda. To start off with is that I'm talking about a country that's generally put into the status of a developing nation. In other words, it doesn't have the strongest economy, and there's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is it's landlocked. So it doesn't have strong ports. In other words, it's not easy to bring stuff in and out of Rwanda. It has to be either brought overland or flown in. And I will say, actually, they're building a second airport in Kigali, specifically for transport, specifically to improve their ability to import and export. But that is something that is still being built up. It's also a country that doesn't have a lot of, I would say, natural resources that are wanted by the Western world. It's very agriculturally focused. And that's again part of the economic status. Is that I will say this is a country that I won't say is incredibly strong economically, but it's also a country where I've watched people not just make do with what they have, but really seem to be, thriving or surviving incredibly well, not looking like they're making do, but rather really building fairly rich lives with what we might see as limited resources. Rwanda obviously has an incredibly turbulent history, as do most countries in Africa. It was a country that was colonized first by the Germans and then the Belgians. And then what Rwanda is most famous for is the genocide that took place in 1994, which I will say was a horrific, horrific event. But in terms of events like this, it was also one of the shorter ones you'll ever see in Africa. It was literally the entire thing took place over 100 days. And they actually, since that time, are considered one of the more stable countries in Africa. And so you're dealing with a country that had this horrific event, but has done amazing things in terms of how they have brought in reconciliation, about a big focus on education. Matter of fact, that's one of the, I want to say, one of the, to me, something that's incredibly impressive about Rwanda is President Kagame, when he took over, he prioritized two things, healthcare and education. And so one of the big things they did was making sure they were setting up school systems that were available to everybody. And probably more importantly, that they set up school systems that were available to girls as well as boys, which had not necessarily been the tradition previously. It's also a country, like many countries in Africa, that has a very strong oral culture. So there's not necessarily, or there wasn't necessarily what we might see as a strong written culture or reading culture, because a lot of what they did was based on oral tradition. And there are official languages. The language that everybody speaks here is Rwandan, but there's not a lot published in Rwandan. And the reason for that is you're talking about a small country that doesn't have its own publishing industry and doesn't necessarily have a big market for a publishing industry um, at the moment. And so the idea, of getting things published in Rwandan is limited because you're going to have limited publishers who are going to take that on. And because the return on investment is not fantastic. Since 2012, English has been the second language taught in all schools. Prior to that time, it was French. It was changed officially in 2000 years. There has pushback, but but there has been a push to include French as well, because many people still think that's an important part of their culture and being able to speak with older generations, and also because the libraries that I've worked with there, they still actually have decent French collections. And so they want to make sure the resources they have are accessible. The work that I've done there have been with school libraries, and they've been specifically, well, I don't want to say two schools, but in two groupings, so to speak. The first one is schools that are overseen by the Benebikira sisters. And this is actually a an order of nuns. It was the first order of nuns that welcomed Africans into the sisterhood. It was pretty much founded in Africa. And I've actually spent time at the mother house in Save, Rwanda. But they oversee about 200 schools overall, at all levels. And I've spent time at four of them. The first one is the Marayundo, a girls' school. And this one I was originally connected with because it was actually funded and built by a nonprofit organization in Boston called the Marayundo Initiative. And I got connected, myself and Nanette Veilleur, who is a professor of computer science, were connected with that. And we went out, she worked with the technology, and I went and worked with the library. And the picture on the left here is actually from our first trip. That's the two students I went with and the students actually at Marayundo. But I've also worked with a Fawe school in eastern Rwanda, which is an area called Kayonza. And Fawe is actually, for lack of a better way of saying it, a chain of schools. It's not really that, but it's schools that have been established, and there's Fawe schools in multiple countries in Africa, and I know of at least two of them in Rwanda, and I've worked with the one that's in Kayonza that again is overseen by the Benebikiras. Immaculate Conception and St. Bernadette's are both schools in the southern part of Rwanda, and Immaculate Conception is kind of a unique school in that it was originally set up as a boarding school for the orphans of the genocide. And it's actually just kept going since then. And they have a beautiful library set up. One of the people I worked with, an American nun, Sister Ann Fox, her niece actually raised the money to build the computer lab in the library at Immaculate Conception. And so they actually have a really nice setup there. St. Bernadette's is actually one of the top schools in the country, and I worked with the library there as well. The other school that I've worked with is SOLA, and it's actually the School of Leadership Afghanistan. And it's a boarding school that's actually now in Rwanda, but that was originally outside of Kabul. And that basically very quickly moved to Rwanda when the Taliban took over. And I'll talk a little bit more about that school in a bit. But I just wanted to let you know the work that I've done in Rwanda, who I was actually working with. Let me start by talking about on the trips to Rwanda, what did I bring with me? And one of the first picture you see here is uh, 7 boxes of books that I took on as luggage. And that was actually the easiest and the most inexpensive way to bring books over. When I talk about it's not easy to get to transport things, it really isn't. And I looked at a lot of different ways because in that trip I was specifically going to Kigali, and that can be a little bit easier because everything in Rwanda goes through Kigali. And I looked up DHS, or no, not D, regardless. I looked up one of the international shippers, and it was going to cost me close to $2,000 to try to ship them, whereas it cost me about $1,200 to take them as luggage. So I mean, kind of a significant difference there. But I also brought things like um, letter labels, and I'll explain, that was part of how I did the organizing. I brought tools for, covering books or tape for reinforcing spines because book repair was a big part of what I did there. Hot glue guns. God, so important in book repair. And again, just certain markers for also of how for the classification systems. So usually every time I've gone, I've had 2 suitcases, but only 1 suitcase worth of clothes because I've had to spread them out so that I didn't overpack. But my suitcases always had books, always had supplies, always had things that were intended for use while I was there. So one of the things that I know Chris and I talked about this, and this is part of how this presentation came up, is how do I actually make selections about the books that I bring? And how do I make some of those decisions? Because one of the things that I always try to you know, keep in mind as I'm working, as I'm putting these together and I'm trying to bring things, is I don't want to just present a Western point of view. I don't want to just present a bunch of American books. I want to make sure that the girls that I'm working with, that they find something that they want to read, that they find something that they actually enjoy. But I'm also not independently wealthy because, as many of you know, I'm a librarian. I might be a library professor, still not going to make me independently wealthy. Um, so with, I was going to say with the trips, a lot of what has gone into it is I start with donations. And when we went in 2019, we did a big book drive at SLIS, and we got so much stuff. I've also, but one of the things that we did is I was taking these donations, and I've always been very clear when I'm taking these donations, um, they're going to have one of two uses. I was going to say I can bring them to the country, or I might, sell them in order to get some of the things I'm looking for. We actually had a very big book sale in the student union at Simmons and raised about $700 to focus on titles that one had been requests from the girls before that we knew were popular titles, to try to find titles that were from African authors to, kind of bring a better variety of things. I've also been incredibly lucky in that several of my former students have graciously allowed me to go through their collections when they've weeded titles. And before when they're having library sales or friends of the library sales, they've actually allowed me to come in and go through the materials first and see what I could find and see, what titles I can pull and, bring with me. But I've also had, great friends, families, and colleagues who have also offered up books. my aunt, who is a former librarian, is still collecting books for me. I actually right now have about a dozen books in my garage that I'm hoping to be able to eventually bring back over to Rwanda. But again, it hasn't just been like one thing. I've actually been able to use my network, so to speak, to come up with different donations. I also have purchased, as I mentioned, we were able to raise money. And again, an amazing former student introduced me to a nonprofit group that she works with. And they've actually, some of the women that were involved with that literally gave me gift cards to Barnes and Noble to go buy materials, or actually bought the materials themselves when they knew some of the titles. And so I have been able to do some direct purchases that have been based on, like I said, things that have been mentioned about books that people are looking for, or titles that they are interested in. The first time I was there, we were able to do some purchases in Kigali at a grocery store that had actually a very large book selection. And I should also say, all the books that I bring over are in English. And, there's a few reasons for that. As I said before, there really isn't a selection in Ken Rwandan. I don't necessarily have an option of getting translations of books, or for that matter, getting a large selection of books in Ken Rwandan. The other one is because English is the second language that they learn in all of these schools. This is actually helping with their education. It is actually helping with their comprehension and, being able to take in English. And then, as I've already touched on some of this, but again, how do I decide which books to bring? And like I said, I've had requests. And if you look at the picture here, you might notice the Twilight series is among these books. I that has been a request, as have the Harry Potters. Teen romances are very popular because again, these are teenage girls. They still do very much enjoy that. Will look at things like science fiction and fantasy that can provide a more diverse worldview, or perhaps not even a, I want to say a worldview based on Earth, but looking at other cultures and other ideas, and just being able to take it out of the dominant hegemony, so to speak. And this is where I look at content, culture, and representation. One author that I've brought many books over on is M.K. Jemison, as well as Nadedi, and I know I'm not saying her name right, Okorafor, both of whom are African writers, and have written some absolutely wonderful um, futuristic novels, about Africa if it hadn't been colonized, but they're much more representative. I have brought many books, that show the African American experience in the U.S. I had been hesitant to do so at first until I spoke with a young woman who was working at Mariundo, who had actually gone to college at Curry College. She'd gotten a scholarship and gone to Curry College, and she said that she wished she had actually understood the racial tensions in the U.S. better before she came to the U.S. Because I can tell you in Africa, there aren't that same kind of racial tensions. They don't understand. This is making them sound bad. It's not that they don't understand. It's just that, you know, Africans are the majority, so they don't stand out. I stand out in Rwanda. And it's very, when they get to the US, it's the other way. She said that it would have been helpful for her to have a better understanding of that. And so that's then been something I have brought in more of. And as I said, I also pull popular titles like, the Twilight series, the Harry Potters, the Hunger Games series, the Shadow and Bone series. It's just, I also look in, and I talk to my friends, family, and colleagues who are children's YA librarians, and get a sense of what are some of the popular titles in that too. And with one of the one I talked about, St. Ignatius, that's actually a school that's co-ed. So when I bring books for that school, I really kind of take the time to look for ones that are aimed at boys. to make sure that I'm being representative of both genders. And that, and by the way, I don't just look for girls' books when I'm bringing these, but when I've been bringing things specifically for St. Ignatius, Immaculate Conception. Sorry, I'm not sure why I had the wrong name there. I was very much searching out books that were aimed at teen boys to make sure that there was a full representation. So the work that I've actually done there, and this I'm sure is kind of interesting for those of you in technical services, is figuring out a lot of the work that I focus on has actually been setting up their fiction collections, their pleasure reading collections, because most of the school libraries in Rwanda are set up initially to hold the textbooks. The Rwandan government provides the textbooks and they stay in the library, and the students come and check them out for class and return them afterwards. And so that has always been the primary reason for the libraries in most of the Rwandan schools. And the way that it's set up is they are organized by subject and by year. And it's with the schools I've worked with, they're basically grades 6 through 12. And so you'll have, and it's either going to be they have all the books for grade 6 in one place and then have it by subject, or some of them have it by subject and then by year within that subject. It depends on the actual library. So what I have done is gone in and worked with their fiction collection. Now, Mariundo was unique in that it actually had a very large fiction collection because a lot of people had been bringing things over for over a decade, but it was all just sitting there. It really wasn't organized. And the girls, more importantly, the girls didn't feel comfortable, didn't necessarily have a good way of telling whether or not they felt they could actually read the titles. What I mean is those, when the girls come in grade 6, they all come in with having taken English, but with very different levels of how well they, how well and how comfortable they feel in the language. And so one of the things we decided that we made the decision to do was to arrange the books by reading level or reading comprehension. And we actually used the Rwandan flag as the colors. And it was green, yellow, and blue. And it's in the order that it appears on the flag. You have first the green stripe, the yellow stripe, and then the blue stripe. And so green was introductory. And that was, you feel it's easy to read, it's for beginners, helping to build your English skills. Intermediate is more challenging. It's once you start feeling a little bit more comfortable, you can read that more. It's good for improving vocabulary and your comprehension. And then advanced is actually you are comfortable in reading English. And that also one of the things we did agree on is that advanced also usually has some more mature themes. And so this is part of how we looked at and decided what to do. And I would love to tell you that I came up with all this by myself, but I have to give a lot of credit to the students that I worked with because we spent about a week figuring out how granular we wanted to get with how we organize things. And one of the things that we realized, and this is, interestingly enough, to me, this is an incredibly important part of access. We realized regardless as to what we did, it had to be functional and usable, have good usability that when we left, it would survive past us. That we didn't need to be there for people to understand the system. And that's why we decided on reading levels and colors. So that would be easy to understand and easy to identify. And once we got out of the fiction, we had some other things there that we kind of looked at, kind of the nonfiction, and we assigned those colors too, and had those separated out. And one of the things that we did do, and you see with the signs I have here, we put the signs in English, and then worked with some of the students to then translate those signs into Kinyarwanda, so that anybody could understand what we talked about with the different levels and what the different items were. And I went back and saw this school in 2023, and these signs are still up, and this library is still using the system very successfully. The students can really interact. And actually, they've taken, if you look at the picture on the right, we had some book covers that were falling apart, and we took them off and we used them for decorations. They've actually expanded on the decorations. The girls have put up things like talking about world flags and celebrating them and added things to the library and really kind of helped build it as library's place. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. The other thing that we worked on was book repair, doing what we could to repair books. This is where we realized we needed a glue gun. But yeah, again, using simple packing tape to reinforce spines, you know, to finding ways to, taking the book covers off of a lot of books because they were just falling apart. And we didn't actually have the stuff that you could that for protecting book covers. Uh, bringing, again, bringing the film to cover paperback books to give them a longer life. Because again, it's not easy to replace any of these once they're gone. And we wanted to make them last, do what we could to make them last as long as possible. And so this is just an example of how we had it organized. You can see that we have the color and we organized it by color and the first letter of the author's last name. We didn't go any further than that. And part of that was just so like if you were looking for a book and you knew it was in D, it would be easy to go back and find. You know, but that was, like I said, we were trying to make it a, when I say a basic system, I don't want it to sound like somehow I was thinking like they couldn't handle it. But, again, the people who are running these libraries are people who haven't worked with libraries before. It's not that they're not smart. It's not that they're not intuitive. It's just libraries are a new system for them. And we want to make sure that whatever we contribute is easy to continue. And then as you build that, you can start, and the libraries are small enough that this is an effective way to do it. The public library that I showed you, they actually use Dewey, the Dewey Decimal System, which again, I will say it was this was a library that was influenced by the American Embassy across the street from it. But as I said, like I said, this is part of what we did and how we had it organized. And I said, we did this initially in 2018, and I went back in 2023, and it was still being used this way. It was still very effective. The library still was very organized. Like the fiction collection was still was in better shape. Because again, one of the things that was happening, it wasn't even just that the books were just on the shelf. The books were also getting wear and tear from how they were sitting on the shelves because it wasn't organized and they were just kind of placed. And it was things that were actually breaking spines and things that were creating wear and tear in addition to the actual use of the libraries. And then this is the a bigger shot of the library in general. And what you see in the picture on the left, that first thing, those are the textbooks. But on the right, like I said, in the picture on the right, you have the textbooks, but then you have the fiction books. And we actually rearranged the shelves because they were just in straight rows. We rearranged the shelves to create spaces for tables so that students can come in and sit down and that they could use a space. And I will tell you, the day after we did that, we went in to do some more work, and there were 4 girls around the table doing their math homework. Like as soon as we gave them the space, they were using it. It wasn't just to come in to look at books. They were using it to actually do work like we would traditionally see. And nobody told them like, hey, you could do homework here. We walked in and they were already doing that. They were already engaged with the library in that way. So that, having that space for them to engage was very important. So in terms of SOLA, this was the other one that I worked with, and this was it was a boarding school that was set up by Shabana here, who was an exchange student to the U.S. in high school. She went to Michigan and then went to college, and she was trying to figure out how to get more Afghan young women educated and scholarships. And one of the things that she realized is that she actually had to start in Afghanistan. And so she set up this school that was a boarding school outside of Kabul. And as the US was pulling out of Afghanistan, she realized that she was going to need to move the school and move it fairly quickly. And one of the things that she did, she was trying to look at places that were close to Afghanistan and the surrounding countries, but it was completely out of her reach financially. And a friend of hers put her in touch with actually President Kagame of Rwanda, and they offered space and they offered the ability. And before she actually could officially do anything, the Taliban took over, but she got every student, staff member, and faculty member out of Afghanistan into Rwanda. And they, I mean, they're at this time they were set up in a former hotel, which was kind of interesting. But the library was set up was what used to be a meeting room, and they had actually a pretty good collection of books, as you can see here. But this is what I walked into was it was kind of arranged. One of the students, former or one of the teachers, her mother came over, was librarian, and tried to do some organizing of it. But they didn't necessarily have a strong system. They were just trying to get things into better categories. And the books again were kind of sitting on the shelves. And these bookcases were also very big. And it was one of the things that the books didn't necessarily always fit well. But this is another shot of some of the before, that you have kind of books grouped together and put that way. And one of the things I realized with working with SOLA was the three levels I had weren't actually enough because they actually had young children's books, but they also had a really good collection of adult fiction. And so I actually expanded the reading levels to early readers. And this is what we would probably look at as like first chapter books, ones that still have a lot of pictures in it, but these ones were like definitely for people who were just learning English. And again, the same levels for the introductory, intermediate, and advanced, but then we also had the section for adult fiction because most, pretty much, not, I don't want to say most of, basically, the majority of the teachers were actually American or British. And so they used the library for this reading as well. I mean, don't get me wrong, there was a Rwandan teacher who taught Islamic studies, and there were teachers who taught uh, the languages of Afghanistan, which of course I'm forgetting the actual name, um, the actual languages at the moment, because they didn't want the girls to lose any connection to their own cultural background. And again, these were things that I thought of when I brought stuff over. I will say though, one of the goals for the students at SOLA is to eventually is to bring them to the level where they can actually then go to boarding schools in the US and Canada. And so actually having books in English is even more important at that point because they need to be able to build their English comprehensive skills. And so again, just like I had done with the other schools, I set up this system and organize the libraries in that way. And one of the things I want to point out, the Quran, if you look in the picture on the left, the Quran is in the top shelf. That's actually a requirement. Qurans are supposed to always be shelved above the heart. It's actually part of the faith. They're supposed to be placed someplace that is above the heart. So regardless as to how the library is set up, I had to make sure that no matter how I organized things, that I had space on a top shelf for the Quran. So that was, it wasn't a challenge, but it was always something to keep in mind as I was figuring out how I was going to organize the different pieces of the library. And this is actually just shots from the last time I was there. If you can see right here, these were actually new bookshelves that we got when I was there that I worked with the administration to get that actually fit most of the books better. They were smaller, so you could actually put more books on, and that the books actually fit within the bookshelves really well. And we actually ordered because when I was there, we got this huge donation from Oxford Books, and a lot of them were books that were more aimed for the classroom. So we ordered two more of these bookshelves to be put over with the classrooms so that the students could actually access these resources while they were in class. That they could get, some of these books that were related to, some of them were reading comprehension, but they were also geography, they were math books, they were science books, and it made more sense. And by the way, I kept two copies of anything that went out to the classroom. Two copies stayed in the library for use in the library. But this was one of those cases of where were they going to have most likely to be used? And they were more likely to be used as the students were in class rather than afterwards. And so it was really important to me. And actually, I will say the administration agreed that was an important, that it was important for them to have ease of access there. This top picture is giving you just a long shot of the library. This was a place that girls liked to hang out. They came in their off times to do it. It was a very comfortable place. It was also a place you can kind of see over here. They had a little area that they set aside as a kind of a classroom space. So classes would come in there as well. And this last space, the big picture, was the beginnings of a maker space that they were working to put together, to bring things in. And for, I mean, just basic crafting, having, bringing in yarn, bringing in glue, bringing in paper, bringing in different ways that girls could be creative. And, this is where I would bring book covers that we weren't using or any other kind of resources. And let me tell you, actually, the girls at both SOLA and at the Benebikira schools, it is amazing how creative they were and the things that they could do with just little pieces. The first time I was at Mariundo, they put on a fashion show, and the dresses these girls fashioned without cutting a single piece of fabric, that they just use ways of pinning and tying, and it was absolutely amazing in the things that they did. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen because that was my last slide, and I would happily answer okay, let me see. I see that I have two questions and I'll answer those right away. First one is, what is the youngest age of the students you're getting books for? And with the Benebikira schools, you're talking about 11, 12, 13, like grade 6. At SOLA, I would say you kind of had a similar age group. However, their reading levels were sometimes more, which might, their English reading levels were probably, some of them are closer to, I want to say, fourth or fifth grade. So I always made sure to bring titles that fit within that as well, so that they could, so people could feel more comfortable as they were trying to learn to read English. And again, Carolyn, please keep asking all the questions that you want to ask. I'm happy to answer them. But then, um, do they acquire new books in your absence or only when you visit? Actually, most of these libraries have other people who will bring books for them. Um, with SOLA, one of the things that was helpful, there's an international school in Kigali that actually donated quite a few books when SOLA first started putting their resources together. You have people who have worked at the embassy, or who have been at the embassy there, and a lot of them will donate books out when they leave as well. So and like Mariundo, the initiative brings over books all the time. I'm nowhere near the only person who has done this. And it's just usually when I go, I'm bringing a greater quantity of them. But they still do get books in the meantime. Um, Let me see. Bookstores in Kigali to buy. Actually, it's limited in terms of bookstores. There really isn't like how we think of a bookstore. I mentioned early on how I purchased books at a grocery store. When I say grocery store, think more of how we might see a Target or Walmart that has groceries in it, and that they tend to have a lot of things, and they actually had books in those. But an actual bookstore, I have yet to really come across that. I have books tend to be part of other stores rather than being a formal bookstore. And that's the thing, is that to get it even to a bookstore is highly expensive. To get, so many things into Rwanda can be incredibly expensive, and it ends up not being worth the cost because they can't necessarily transfer that. The reason why I could find books in Kigali is because a lot of non-governmental organizations or NGOs have headquarters in Kigali, because they work with Rwanda in general in terms of helping with, medical issues across the country, working with helping to build crops. Just like, so you have a lot of people in Kigali who are not Rwandan. And so they tend to cater quite a bit to that audience and provide resources for people in those situations. None of the I was going to say, nobody has has a formal circulation system. And this is something that every time I've tried to work to get that, something has happened, like, the pandemic, which ended up, keeping me from going back for a while. And also, like with the Benefit schools, they can't pay for an ILS. They can't pay for an integrated library system. So whatever there is, you actually have to have it, even if it's just something as simple as an Excel file. And you have to have the technology, you have to have a dedicated computer for it. Again, that's not necessarily always the easiest thing to do. In terms of tracking it, they actually have like at Mariundo, they have a card system. The girls actually have cards that stay at the library, and when they check something out, it's written on the card so that they know who has what books. That was something I was trying to institute at SOLA, and I was supposed to go back in early 2024, but several things happened. Like I actually was moving and was unable to go. But one of my goals at that time was to create a better system for checking books out. Um, at the Faway School in Kayonza, there is a woman, I mean, again, the woman who works there, she tracks what people are taking out, but it's right now it's still very much, done through paper. Let me see, what is the quantity, frequency, makeup of American volunteers you work with? Um, at SOLA, I worked with a lot of Americans, and that's just because that actually Boston seems to be a hotbed of schools who work with or of organizations that work with schools in Rwanda. I say that flippantly, but you have the because Sola's American counterpart, or the organization that does the work in does work for Sola in the US, is actually headquartered in Boston, as is the Mariundo Initiative. And so that's how there's a lot of American connections with that. But I can tell you when I've been there, um, in terms of volunteering, the Americans I've been with have either been my students or they're people that are already working there. That's not to say that there aren't others. Because, again, there's a lot of people who do try to do things, especially I'd say with Mariundo, they do regular trips over to try to engage with the different schools at all levels, not just the library. I'm obviously focused on the library because that's what I do. But there are other people who've gone over, like, I know through the Mariundo initiative, somebody went over with her family for a month, and she did, she's an English teacher, so that's what she worked with them on. There have been, I know the first time I was over there, there was a young woman who had just graduated from undergrad at Tufts, and she was acting as a counselor and helping the students with, applying for colleges outside of Rwanda, and that was her job. She actually wasn't so much as a volunteer as more of a fellowship. She was actually being funded by the Mariundo Institute to do that. But that's been my interactions with volunteers actually in Rwanda. It's either been students that have been part of a travel course that I've been a part of, or it's usually connected with one of the initiatives, or somebody who's actually employed, which is what I worked with at SOLA. Yeah.
There had been a question earlier about how you
Oh,
got started going to Rwanda and working as a librarian there. I know you talked about the one organization. Did one just kind of lead to another?
yeah,
Or
it was really kind of interesting how I got connected to Sola, in all honesty. And this is one of those times where the power of Google, believe it or not. Um, they were uh, they were setting up the Sola, and the person who was kind of running things on the ground in Kigali was trying to hire a librarian, and all the applicants they got were actually a lot of them were from Uganda, and they were academic librarians. And she was getting like, it wasn't that she didn't want to hire them, it's that she wasn't sure that they were going to stay and that it would be, what they were looking for. And so she's like, well, she literally did a search, library school, Rwanda. And an article on Myself on the Net came up that had run in ALA about the work that we did in 2018. And she actually reached out to both of us, and I ended up talking to her and setting up a time. And that was my first trip. I spent 5 weeks from January to early March in, in Rwanda working with Sola based on that connection. And yeah, it was one thing leading to another. Um, you know, I've worked with the I've worked with the Mariano Institute, but I've also worked specifically with the Benebikira sisters because when I've been over there, especially in 2019, we spent time where we tended to be housed was where the nuns stayed. And so we ended up spending a lot of times with the nuns and building those relationships. When I went over in 2021, it was specifically about training teachers about using technologies than it was about the library. It was how to use PowerPoint for a classroom, putting classes online and what are some of the things to think about searching skills, talking about the databases and Wikipedia and doing Google searches. And I've also I did a little bit of, information literacy and searching with the English classes at SOLA as well. So the things I've done haven't actually just been about the library. They've been about the broader things that you do as a librarian. But yeah, one definitely led to the other.
I have like a two-part question.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm kind of thinking about how censorship would be like. Are there ever any restrictions on the books that you can put in or the content? Are you ever given any, or is anything ever removed, or are you ever given any guidelines? And then my second question is like, do you think that book bans would be kind of comprehensible to a lot of these Rwandans? Maybe more so in the Afghan school. I don't know, but like, how do you think that would fit into their culture?
Actually, I don't know that they would see book bans the way that we do, just because there's I'm trying to think of the way to say this, but there's more of an understanding that if somebody says this is not right, there's more of an acceptance of it. I think it's more because you have a bit of a patriarchal culture, but a a very clan focused, but also a reverence for elders and for authority. And so it makes it sound like we live in anarchy here, but the idea if they were to yeah, Chris, I saw that face. Um, if they were told that they didn't think that this was appropriate, I think most of them would be like, okay, it's not appropriate. They might ask why. They might ask for more of an explanation, but I don't think the way they would have the same reaction to book bans. And I think that also in Kigali, you'd get more pushback. As you get further away from Kigali, you'd get less, if that makes sense. But the other thing in terms of, what not to bring over, I can tell you that we are actually very careful about what we introduced in LGBTQ. And it wasn't because we didn't want to, but it's because in Africa, that can be a very, I'm trying to think of a good way of saying this. I don't want to say contentious, but it can be a very, it is a topic that's important to be careful about. And part of that is simply because of the ways in which LGBTQ people can actually be in danger there. And by the way, I never saw any of that in Rwanda, but I also never saw anything, I never saw anything, I should say. But it was always one to be, be careful. That's not to say that we didn't include any, because Lord knows one of the books that we had at Sola was Red, White, and Royal Blue, but it was also things that I want to say to some degree, just out of respect with knowing that it doesn't have a place in the culture like it does in the US. So we were careful about that. We didn't completely remove it, but we also wanted to be respectful. And this sounds horrible, but no, just be respectful about expectations. I know that the nuns, this is one that's a little bit more fun. The nuns weren't necessarily big fans of romances, but my God, the girls wanted them. They asked for romance books because again, they were teenage girls. It's nice to know that there are universal principles with young girls that they all have some of these enjoy some of these things. So again, we tended to bring the romances, but we had, careful about the level of quote spiciness that might have been in them. I mean, that was, again, that was part of the content. I also, and this is, a horrible way of saying this, but I was always kind of careful about not bringing too many books that were about the blonde American cheerleader. I always tried to bring more things that had some kind of diversity to them. That there were books that the students could, recognize themselves to some degree in. That, they could, and enjoy it and not necessarily just always feel othered while reading. And also, I honestly didn't want to just push the American point of view. I did try to find authors from, different backgrounds. Like I said, very specifically looking at African authors as much as I could. Um, Looking for, any, other works that had been translated into English from other parts of the world, just trying to have other points of view so that it wasn't just a very strongly American point of view that was coming through in the books.
I was going to ask if the ecclesiastical, elements
Yeah.
had any, kind of role in the selection. And frankly, it might even be dangerous for some people to be in certainly some places to be carrying those books identity. I don't know about if that was
Yeah.
something that you had to consider.
No, I mean, these were things that we, again, wanted to be careful about. Um, as I said, it's you want to, one, I wasn't ever going to bring anything that was going to, and I don't know that they exist, but I certainly wouldn't have ever picked up a book that was attacking anything about the current Rwandan government. Nope, not going to do that. Um, again, also probably wouldn't have, picked up books that were overly critical of anybody they saw as allies either. It's trying, and I mean, again, part of this is trying to put together books that the students are going to enjoy, that they're going to, because these girls do not have a lot of downtime. They are in class a lot, and when they're choosing something to do on their own, I want to make sure it's something that they enjoy. And if they're picking up a book to read for fun, they should be able to just actually enjoy it and not feel attacked or feel left out from it, or or just, you know, really take joy in the process and many of these girls do. Like I said, that first year that I was there and we got books in Kigali and brought them back and we were processing them and we had about six girls who were helping from the school who were helping us and we're showing them how to actually, figure out the reading level and to organize them. These girls were vibrating with excitement about being able to get a hold of these books. And we're like, no, we have to process them first. But oh my God, they really, really wanted them. They really wanted to be able to take these books out. And I mean, that level of excitement, I wanted to make sure that we were providing resources. We're going to keep doing that for them. That when they read them, even if they didn't like the book, they could figure out what they didn't like and go to the next thing, and really kind of engage.
It's funny because some of the books you mentioned earlier about that were they were requesting, I could see not wanting, they're not necessarily representing romances that are ones you want girls in your life to emulate or
Yeah, I know.
be
I will
pining
tell you though,
for.
yeah, when I was at the Faway School in Kayonza, and one of the days we got everything organized and put up, and this was the first time. This is actually first time they had any significant contribution to the fiction. They had some things, but nowhere near what we were bringing. And the girls came in. The woman who kind of ran the library, they came in on their break and they looked at it, and she was like, "You should go check out the new books." And I'm, creepy me. I'm like peering around the corner just to kind of watch it because I didn't want them to be self-conscious. And I'm really not kidding. One of the girls, they get there and she went, "Twilight." Okay. Why does that have to be the book you're that excited about? But okay. Yeah, I mean, this is what I mean by the popular ones. Okay, yes, Twilight. But thankfully, that's waning. I don't really feel like I need to keep bringing that back as much. But at the same time, I want to, I mean, I want to have books that they're going to enjoy, that they actually are going that they've heard about and want to read. That's why the Harry Potters are always there because that's a series that everybody has heard about.
All right. It's 3 o'clock. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Does anyone have any other questions? And I'm also going to put your email in the chat.
Oh, yes.
They can reach out to you if they want. Um, but yeah, thanks. Okay, yeah. Thanks so much. I will send everyone a link to the slides and the recording. I'll probably just put it up on YouTube. I'm gonna stop recording now.